My name is Michael Gardin, and the workshop I'll be presenting today is titled An Introduction to Queer People and Queer Identity. So to start, I'd like to have everyone take a second to think about and even jot down some items. So I'd like you to think about, how do you define the concepts gender and sexuality? And how would you describe you came to know these meanings? So what helped you understand them? Under what circumstances? And this can be anything from family, community, school. All right, so I'd like you to hang on to those thoughts and we'll return to them later in the workshop. So I also like to begin with a disclaimer. The word queer and the identity might mess with or trouble our expectations. The term is undefinable, so it has multiple meanings and multiple uses, and often many of the meanings and uses are contested, so there's a lot of debate going back and forth over how this word should be used. It's also going to mess with our analytical thoughts, so we might feel a sense of discomfort with the identity in it, forcing us to think in new ways that we might not yet have. So I want to start with just some introductions of how the word queer is used. The first way is a personal identity. So you might hear someone say, I identify as queer, or I'm queer. It is also used as a collective identity, so an umbrella term. The example is you might hear someone refer to the queer community, or even someone who's a part of that community saying someone is a queer singer signals that they are a member of the spectrum of LGBT. Queer is also an idea, concept, and sometimes used as a verb. So it's an academic word. You might hear someone say, I study queer theory, or I study queer literature. It's also used as a verb, and sometimes it's politicized. So an example that I'll get to later in the workshop is I queered the census. Okay, so there's an action going on that queer performs. So I'd like to start with some of the history of this word to give us some good context for how it's used. Queer was used in the past and sometimes in the present still as a hateful way to refer to people. So it was people who had appeared to be a sexual or gender minority, or LGBT, which refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So this was used in a hateful way to refer to these people, or it could be anyone who appeared to be, behaved as, or otherwise fell outside the norms of sexuality and gender. Okay, so we want to think about this as being used in the past and sometimes still in the present as a slur. Then in the early 1990s, queer people started using the word to talk about themselves. It was used to define a group of people who had something in common that was different from norms of society. It was a way of making a slur yelled at someone turned around to claim a presence. So you may have heard a slogan, we are here, we are queer. So it's a moment of empowerment, taking something that was used in hate and turned it around as an empowering reclamation. So much of this reclamation happened in terms of activism. So many activists in the USA were using this word with anger and pride to signal an activist rebellion. It was to take a stand against things like homophobia, heteronormativity, gender normativity, and other forms of oppression, especially those relating to sexuality and gender. And I'm going to get to some more specifics about the definition of these terms like homophobia, heteronormativity in a few moments. So, but more on history, many trace the use of queer as it's been reclaimed to one activist group, Queer Nation, that was emerging in the 1990s. And Queer Nation was an in-your-face campaign Another characteristic about this activist organization was that it wasn't drawing lines between solid identities, so between straight or gay, but instead using the word queer. So in this way, it imagined sexuality and gender as fluid. So moving up to the present day, queer is also used in a broader kind of movement. So people might refer to a queer agenda. So queer can be used sometimes queer theory, queer thought, or just as a political identity to change the way we understand identity, sexuality, gender, desire. And it's moving away from the prominence of only speaking about gay and lesbian identities, so that other intersections of identities like race, class, nationality, they don't get left behind or not discussed, and also so that other sexual and gender identities are not erased. And we'll get to some more of those other identities in a second. So these changes that queer has allowed people to start thinking about have left large implications on how we think about society's power and how we understand and classify ourselves. So today, it is even more popular than perhaps in the past, in the 90s, in its emergence, as an identity. So you may hear many people self-identifying as queer. It's also very popular to be used as a marker of a community. It's also a word referring to certain theories and thoughts, and a word that activists and academics use. But these uses don't come without debates. So there are constant debates over its meanings, also who can or cannot be queer, since it has sort of a vast range of uses and meanings. So I just want to make sure that we're aware that there isn't some sort of solid definition of queer. Instead, it's always changing, always expanding, always debated. So I want to give us some helpful terms. When I say collective identity, there are some acronyms that people utilize to talk about a group of sexual or gender minority. So the first one is LGB. So that refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual. LGBT refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. LGBTQ refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And then the last acronym here that is probably the newest and most inclusive includes queer, I for intersex, A for asexual, and A for ally. So often people will use these acronyms or the word queer interchangeably to refer to a community. So another foundational understanding that we need to grasp with to discuss queer identity is the importance of society's influence. So we live in a society that is based on strict gender roles and strict norms about sexuality that enforces certain beliefs, certain practices, and then oppression. So I'd like to give us a solid definition of norms. A norm is something that is considered usual, typical, or standard. So it's a standard or a pattern, especially of social behavior, that is typically expected of a group. So some of these are very overt, and they're sort of written into rules, such as on campus we have norms of behavior that are written into our codes of conduct, but sometimes they're also implicit. And often when they're implicit, they're all wrapped up in value statements and judgments. So what is normative is celebrated and judged more highly than what is non-normative. So now I want to move to some vocabulary to really inform us, to give us a short guide of some of the definitions of the terms I've been mentioning. The first distinction that I'd like to make is a distinction between two categories that we might often hear used interchangeably, but they in fact have very distinct definitions. So sex, when we are referring to someone's sex, we usually use the words male or female. And sex refers to the biological characteristics that define males and females, and this is usually assigned at birth by a doctor. Gender, on the other hand, refers to socially constructed roles, behaviors, activity, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. So we think of these things as masculine and feminine and how they are expressed. So in other words, gender is not biological. It's actually socially constructed. Okay. Another important term, sexuality. Sexuality in the broadest sense refers to sexual behavior. Sexual orientation and sexual identity are often used similarly, and this refers to the direction of one's sexual desires, which theoretically could be an infinite number of ways that one would organize or discuss or name their desires beyond this common binary of hetero and homosexual. However, those are very common, and this binary is very common in our society today. So heterosexuality means the attraction of women to men and men to women. Homosexuality refers to the attraction of men to men or women to women. Bisexuality refers to the attraction to both men and women, and asexuality refers to having little or no attraction to anyone. Some other words that we hear probably used commonly: gay refers to the identity of a homosexual man, although it's often used as more of an umbrella to refer to both gay men and lesbians. Lesbian refers to the identity of a homosexual woman. And now some terms that describe some of our phenomena, so cultural phenomena. Homophobia refers to the fear and hatred of non-heterosexual individuals. Heterosexism refers to the assumption that heterosexuality is the only normal, so we hear this kind of signal to normativity again, the only normal sexual orientation, and therefore it should be celebrated and privileged by others, something that is still very common and unremarked upon in our culture today. Heteronormativity is the norm and the related practices that rely on the thought that heterosexuality is normal and that all other sexualities are not. Transphobia refers to the hatred and fear of transgender or transsexual individuals. And just a term to kind of grasp with when we're dealing with a community, like I've been describing, is coming out of the closet. When someone says coming out of the closet, this refers to disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, so what does gender identity mean? Gender identity is one's view and or sense of their own gender. Trans with an asterisk or transgender, they're often used interchangeably, refer to an umbrella. So these are umbrella terms to describe people whose gender identity, so their sense of themselves, or their gender expression, so how they express their gender, differs from that associated with their birth or biological sex and body. A transgender individual or a trans individual may or may not undergo medical, legal, or social transition. And since this is an umbrella term, there are many identities that fall under it. So transsexual is another identity, and this identity category refers to individuals who their biological assigned sex at birth does not match with their gender identity, and it usually signifies some sort of medical transition. So that is, an individual will undergo, is undergoing, or has undergone medical procedures to transition one's body. So cisgender is a relatively new word, and this is an identity that refers to one whose assigned sex and gender match, and who is read in society as the gender that the individual identifies as. So in other words, one who is cisgender is one who is not trans, or who does not identify as trans. Just some other terms to grapple with. Gender diverse or gender queer, they're often used interchangeably, refers to one who does not identify with the gender binary in some way. This may include, but is not limited to, identifying as neither male nor female, as both male and female, as a third gender, or as androgynous. Finally, intersex refers to an individual who is born with a biological sex characteristics that are more ambiguous. Okay, so I've continued to talk about the debates about the uses and definitions of queer. So it is still used though, no matter how many debates continue. So let's look at some of the characteristics that are commented upon as how useful queer can be. Well, first, as a collective identity, it's thought to be more inclusive. So if an individual does not see themselves represented in an acronym, so none of the letters refer to their identity, perhaps they don't feel included and represented in that spectrum. So perhaps queer is used as more inclusive. It also stresses fluidity, so it doesn't assign people to a category for a lifetime. So one might be able to shift and change as their identity changes and still use queer to identify themselves. It's also used as a refusal to organize one's sense of themselves or identity around society's norms. So seeing that norms about sexuality and gender can be very limiting and very damaging, and so perhaps queer can be used to signal a refusal to use those norms to organize oneself. It also defies categories. So again, these limitations that categories may hold for some people, queer may be a way to defy those categories and sort of rethink how we identify and how we use identity labels. It also provides room for other aspects of one's identities, so that when someone may use words like gay or lesbian, they're specifically only talking about their sexuality, but perhaps queer could allow them to talk about their sexuality and gender, their sexuality, gender, and race, their sexuality, gender, and class, etc. So, used as a personal identity, in many of the same ways, people comment on queer as being useful in defying categories, in rethinking how we identify, and stressing fluidity. It's also political. So many people use queer as a personal identity to signal a defiance with the value statements and related oppressions placed on people based on these norms of sexuality and gender. It also challenges the assumptions that we can come to understand someone and have expectations about their being based on words they use to describe themselves. So queer really signals that there may be a limitation in any language. Any identity category that we choose is never going to fully describe our whole being as a person. So I asked you to jot down some ideas at the very, very beginning, or at least kind of consider them. I'd like you to return to that for a moment. So I'd like you to think about or jot down some things that you are now thinking about sexuality and gender. So have your thoughts increased or changed at all about these terms and what they mean? Okay, so I'd like you to continue considering that even beyond this workshop. That's really what engaging in queer thought is continuing to reshape our ideas of what we think about identity and really the world around us. So before I conclude today, I really want to give us some tangible examples. So I've talked about how queer is used as an identity, but I'd also like to give you some examples or instances in everyday real world life where queer is used. So the first one is called Queer Bomb. This is a public demonstration to celebrate queer identity and queer people in Austin, Texas. And it was also started out of what many saw as the limitations of the Gay Pride event in Austin. QT, or Queer and Trans Committee of GLBTQ of UTSA. This is a student organization and a committee within it that is an educational effort to inform those on campus about underrepresented and often misunderstood identities. Queer the Census was an activist movement, and I believe it still is an activist movement, where queer is used as a verb. So people were queering the census by adding things in or making new identity categories to make sure that they document and account for the range of sexual and gender identities rather than just being asked to reply to this government document in a really limited way. It's also a focus in school, so queer studies. I teach a course about the theory surrounding the word queer here at UTSA. So now that we've got a lot of information, I want to conclude today and thinking about how we can take this forward and how we can use it as members of our community. So how can we be queer friendly? Well, the first thing is to challenge our own assumptions and expectations. So we want to ask ourselves to not always think that we can clearly fit someone into a box with regard to identity, or if they do identify along some lines, that we can wholly understand their life, what they face on a daily basis, etc., by just that one word. We also want to be able to listen and really let people self-define and self-name. So we don't want to tell people who or what they are, using the words that they use to refer to themselves instead of ones that we're more comfortable with, perhaps. Also, when in doubt, we can always ask politely. So if we're ever curious or wondering about someone's identity, we can kindly ask them. Also, we may find it useful to use gender-neutral language, so when referring to someone's partners or referring to groups of people. And finally, we would be an advocate if we advocate for others around us to do the same. So challenging jokes or even expressions of norms or the limitations of language or the language of other people around us. So that's where I'll conclude today.